Hello, everybody. In today's podcast, we are going to talk about the importance of devotion in the practice of the Islamic religion according to the teachings of Imam Al Ghazali. We are going to explain from some of his teachings regarding the importance of the intention with which the person, the believer, perform the mandatory acts and those who are supererogatory. And we will go deep into the functions of devotional acts in the moral life of the believer according to the Islamic religion and the teachings of such a great Imam. According to Imam Al Ghazali, knowledge and action are regarded as two primary means of realizing the moral ideal, and action is divided into that which is concerned with man's inward self and that which concerns to the outward. The outward action is divided by Al-Ghazali into that which is directed towards God and that which is directed towards one's fellow men. So there is a dual position here for the believer. Those acts that are direct towards God and those towards your neighbor, towards your fellow brother. The first category of action is the same as that of the devotional acts prescribed by the Islamic law, and these are 7 in number. We have the ritual prayer, fasting, zakat. We have the pilgrimage to Mecca. We have reading the Quran, praising of God, and invocation of God, Allah. So the first 4 are obligatory, and the remainder are supererogatory, meaning they are extra, optional for those who are pious. Each of the obligatory acts becomes an act of supererogation when it is performed more frequently than what the law obliges. For example, fasting during the month of Ramadan is obligatory, but to fast on other great days of the year is optional. Therefore, we have that each obligatory set of acts consists of many parts, some of which are such that without them the act is invalid. Some are needed only for its perfection, and some are the means of its excellence, and others are simply for perfecting this excellence, and we will explain the meaning of all these things. These all these parts that we just mentioned are broadly divided into 2 groups according to Imam Al Ghazali, namely those which are basic, meaning necessary for the validity of the act, called the obligatory parts, and those which are complements, perfecting the efficacy of the basic parts, and these are the ones who are optional or extra for the pious. The performance of the obligatory act is relevant to the lower class of virtuous men, and therefore those people who fail to perform such acts are not seen with good eyes. Therefore, those who are able to perform the acts who are extra, meaning these people belong to a higher class according to the virtues, meaning they are more pious, more devout than others. And this is expressed in many of the works of Imam Al Ghazali, and he clearly explains this in his book Bidayat. And let's quote from the book so we can have a clear understanding of what he means by this. Al Ghazali says like this: in respect to his religion, a man stands in one of 3 classes. He might be safe, namely when he confines himself to performing the duties of strict obligation and avoiding sins. Or, number 2, he might be above the standard people, namely when of his will he makes an offering and performs supererogatory acts, meaning those who are extra, like I mentioned before, like fasting, for example, in other days of the year besides Ramadan. And number 3, he might be below the standard, and namely he falls short of what is incumbent upon him. And Imam Al Ghazali says that if you cannot be above the standard, meaning regular people, if you cannot be above, meaning extra pious, at least try to be safe, try to be in the middle. But he said, beware of being below the standard, meaning those who fail to perform the acts, those who don't do anything. And every devotional act is regarded by Imam Al Ghazali as having 2 aspects, one internal and another one external. And its perfect performance depends on the fulfillment of both aspects. And he says and speaks about that the internal aspect, the importance of it. He says that should the internal aspect not be performed, the act is merely motions of the body, and is incapable of producing the desired effect on the soul. Meaning someone that, for example, prays in a mechanical way. He's just memorized the prayer and the movements, and that's all he does. But he doesn't have the concentration of the inner intention that is able to move the soul. If you don't have this inner internal aspect, then there's no effect in the real you, which is the soul, and therefore it's just like merely motions of the body, something mechanical. And the harm of neglecting one particular aspect of the external aspect differs from that of neglecting another. Therefore, this difference is owing to the difference in the grades of the various parts. For example, in the case of, let's say, ritual prayer, for example, or pilgrimage, every part of the external aspect is shown to have an inward aspect dependent of the inward aspect of the act as a whole. If a part is performed with neglect of its corresponding inward aspect, the devotional act is comparable to a man who has eyes but no vision. Therefore, the external aspect of an act, as prescribed in Al Ghazali's books, these ethical works, is more than the act as described in the work of Islamic jurisprudence. It's more. Al Ghazali goes deeper than that, than what we find usually in the books of the Islamic law. And according to Al Ghazali, the inward aspect is the action of the soul, and it involves the performance with single-minded devotion, purity of thought, and absolute sincerity. Something that sometimes Imam Al Ghazali complains that these things are not stressed enough in the books of law. And therefore, he points to the importance to know the deeper meaning of an act. Why are we doing such thing? It's not just doing because we just do because it's the commandment. No, we have to know why. We have to go deeper into the significance of why we perform certain rites and aspects and prayer and fasting and pilgrimage within the Islamic religion. Therefore, there is an inward aspect that sometimes is neglected, and we have to go deep into this into the meaning of the act itself. And regarding the emphasis upon the inward aspect of an act is linked to what Imam Al Ghazali calls the conception of the functions of devotional acts in moral life. He maintains that this kind of inward aspects are prescribed for remembering God. And he explains that for the remembrance of God, we have to turn the soul from this world to the hereafter. Therefore, since the remembrance is present in every act of devotion, therefore perseverance in it means the perseverance in remembrance, as a result of which love of God and intimacy with Him are produced in the soul. Thus, the ultimate aim of devotional acts emerges as love of God and nearness to Him. Now, Imam Al Ghazali also points that besides remembering God, he speaks also of the another function of the devotional acts, and that one is the purification of the soul from vices and making it beautiful with virtues. And to this he points out, while discussing many aspects like ritual prayer as a whole, he says, is prescribed by the Islamic law to enable man to polish the mirror of his soul, to renew his remembrance of God, and to strengthen his faith. Both prostration and genuflection aim at creating the quality of humility in the soul. The function of almsgiving, charity, is to cleanse the soul from miserliness and to generate in it the quality of gratitude to God for granting wealth. The function of fasting, according to Al Ghazali, is to purify the soul from the dominance of passions which impel a man to evil sin, to sin. It is also to acquire a divine attribute and an angelic quality. Knowledge of the inward aspect of pilgrimage helps man to clean his soul. Besides, by doing those acts of pilgrimage whose reasons are unknown, man opposes passions and achieves perfect obedience to God. The recitation of the Quran removes the rust from the soul. The qualities produced from praise of God and the invocation to Him, dhikr, are said to serve as illumination of the soul. Therefore, these various kinds of acts that we just described, and Imam Al Ghazali explains, are prescribed because of their various effects in enlightening the soul. And from all of these statements, Al Ghazali explains that the plain Al Ghazali says that the act of devotion have a twofold function of purifying the soul and making the soul beautiful. Therefore, he speaks of the importance of working on our own soul, purifying our soul, making it beautiful. And he emphasized this. Indeed, he says that this twofold goal, the external and the internal aspect of each of these devotional rituals and acts that we just described, this twofold goal is of course secondary to that of the love of God and of attaining nearness to Him. Therefore, this is the main goal, to love God and to get closer to Him. That's why we perform all of these acts. Therefore, it's not in doing the act by itself, is to find out why these acts are prescribed, what is the final aim. And the final aim to do all of these aspects that we just described according to Islamic law is to get closer to God and to love God, to awaken love towards God. But we have to cleanse ourselves, we have to clean our soul in order to attain such nearness to Him. And therefore, how can we get to that final aim? Well, Al Ghazali tells us, number one, when the soul is cleansed from vices and fortified with virtues, it is drawn near to God. Its love for Him becomes strong, and love for the world becomes weak. We don't care too much about the world and the material things, money. We mainly concentrate about getting close to God, getting close to the Almighty, and our love for Him becomes stronger. Number two, complete polishing of the mirror of the soul causes a light in the soul which serves as a key to intuitive knowledge of the secrets of divine affairs and the subtleties of ethical matters. He says that the aim of action is to purify and cleanse the soul, that the truth might be revealed in it, and that it may be beautified by the true knowledge, which is intuitive knowledge. And such a knowledge of God produces a strong love of Him. Therefore, he really explains about the importance of this. And the final aim of acts of devotion, as we said, is love of God and nearness to Him through remembrance of Him and through the purification of the soul and making it beautiful. Therefore, unlike the philosophers that we find sometimes either within the Islamic world, sometimes outside also, Al Ghazali says, being himself a philosopher also, he says that it is necessary to perform the various kinds of devotional acts at every stage of life, for by these are achieved constant remembrance of God, confirmation of intimacy, and strengthening of love. And therefore, after one has been endowed with this kind of gnosis, this kind of secret mystical knowledge called ma'rifa, and has reached to the goal of life, one's obligation to perform these acts is not abolished. Meaning that once you get to such a high level, it doesn't mean that you stop. No, it remains until death, for it is through them that the intimacy and love which have been acquired will be preserved. So he explains very, very detailed, and also he points to have the desired effect on the soul. Devotional acts need to be performed with sincere intention. This is what we point out before. Intention, concentration, knowing the deeper meaning, sincerely. When we perform such acts as we describe, fasting, and then prayer, and zakat, and all the other ones, we must be sincere when we do these things. That's why faith, belief, iman is important. Be honest with ourselves, the intention, the concentration. And instead of purifying the soul, an ostentatious act makes it more polluted with love of the world and submission to passions. Because some people do such acts for others to see them. Oh, look at him, look at her. How so pious, such a perfect model. And some people do these kind of things just to be seen, to show off. And that's why Ghazali says, be careful. You must be sincere in intention. And God knows what is inside of every human being. You can fool others, you can fool humans, but you cannot fool God. So he said, watch out. You're working on yourself. You're working towards attaining life in the hereafter. Therefore, he says also that these acts should be performed readily and with pleasure. And in order to acquire the ability, one has to undergo the self-training that we have explained, how all these acts indeed are a kind of a training for the believer. And it's an external training and an internal training. And when we combine both, then we can see the results in the outside and the inside, because the outside is a result of what is inside of the person. And when someone is not sincere with his intention, you can smell it, you can guess, you can see that is something that is not right there. You can see that, yeah, this person looks too religious, but there is something is not convincing others. Maybe it might not be easy to notice, but you see some kind of ego, some kind of pride, some kind of doing the act just to be seen. And Al Ghazali explains and puts a lot of emphasis. You have to watch out, you have to be sincere, you have to be careful. You can't fool God. You are playing with your own life. So we just have explained briefly, according to Imam Al Ghazali, the importance of devotional acts within the perspective of the Islamic theology. One of the greatest sheikhs, one of the greatest minds of Islam and all over the world, because Al Ghazali not only was an imam, he was also a great philosopher, a great mystic. His teachings were studied in great universities in Europe. Until the modern day, he is considered one of the great philosophers of the Islamic world, and his teachings are still studied all over the world. And we can see the deep of his teachings and the looking for the inner connection when we perform religious acts, not only within the Islamic religion, though this is the context in which he speaks, but in general for the believer. And even those who don't follow the Islamic way could find a lot of value by listening to the teachings of Imam Al Ghazali. Indeed, there's gold in his teachings. I want to thank you all for listening to this podcast today. In a future podcast, we are going to continue with more about the teachings of Imam Al Ghazali, and we will explain one by one these obligatory devotional acts that we just mentioned, such as ritual prayer, fasting, zakat, pilgrimage, the praise of God, reading the Quran, invocation, and many, many others, in more detail according to the teachings of the great Sheikh Imam Al Ghazali. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you like this material, share it with the people that you think or know that maybe they could benefit from it. And we'll see each other in the next podcast. Have a great day.